Thank you so much for speaking to us. So I just want to start off by asking why forests are important at these talks.
Okay, sure. So forests are really important carbon stores. So to that extent, they're really important for climate change because if you chop down forests, then that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. And so there's a focus at these talks on the tropical forests and on forests in rich countries, which are normally like boreal forests and temperate forests. That's the area that I've been following.
We hear a lot about tropical forests and not so much about these other forests.
Yeah, that's right.
Why do they have a big role?
So they're actually bigger carbon stores. So if you think of the forests that stretch across Russia and across Canada and indeed, forested countries like in Scandinavia, very substantial amounts of carbon locked up in those. And not just forests, but other land uses as well. So peatlands, for example, also very big carbon stores, very important. And how rich countries actually manage those forests and try and keep the carbon locked up, or if they choose to, log those forests or drain those peatlands, that really affects the kind of the carbon balance that we have in the atmosphere, and that has actually a very significant impact on climate change.
And are they being protected sufficiently? Are they being looked after?
Well, that's the problem. So actually this is a very contentious and political area of these talks. So countries want to be able to log their forests without having to incur the penalty of the carbon that goes into the atmosphere from doing that. That's really problematic, and it was a problem for the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, and it's a problem here in these talks as well. Countries with big forests just don't want to have to account for those emissions because they say that would make it very hard for them to meet their overall targets.
Okay, and can you give us a sense of the progress when it comes to this aspect of the negotiations? Are things moving forwards? Are they moving backwards? Should we be optimistic?
They're certainly moving very slowly. From my personal perspective, I don't feel very optimistic about it. So, as I said, countries don't want to account for those emissions, but those emissions are very, very large, and it's a big problem because if you don't account for those emissions, you're actually undermining what the Kyoto Protocol is trying to achieve. So these are all countries that are signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, but if you ignore those emissions, it creates what we call a big loophole, a whole mass of unaccounted emissions that are going to be going up into the atmosphere, but that won't be reflected anywhere on countries' accounts. So actually it's acting to undermine the progress of the integrity of what we're trying to achieve here, and so from that perspective I'm feeling pretty concerned, and the politics is pushing it in the wrong direction, but we do have some champions fighting back, which I can tell you about. So particularly from developing countries, they're very concerned that the Kyoto Protocol is meaningful. So we have countries like Tuvalu, which is the small island state which is about to go underwater because of sea level rise. So right at the forefront of the battle on climate change, actually coming forward with proposals to try and make countries actually account for these emissions and thus protect their forests and store all that carbon. And the Africa group has also been responding to the chair's request for compromise proposals and has come forward with a compromise proposal that would also enhance the environmental integrity of what's going on here. So poor countries fighting back, but it's going to come down to the wire, I think, with ministers having to take final decisions on these things.
And is this something that's going to be kind of signed off and sealed at these talks here? Are we at risk of kind of locking in a bad agreement, or will the negotiations continue?
So what we do want is we want these rules to be concluded, because we don't want rules to be decided on after the targets have been agreed. That's what happened last time, and the rules were even worse because the targets had already been agreed and countries were thinking, how can I design the rules to help me meet the targets? So we do want the rules to be agreed first, but as you say, there's a risk of locking in quite a bad deal. So what me and my colleagues are fighting very hard for is to try and push negotiators and push countries to actually not have a loophole in these talks, but to have environmental integrity and make the Kyoto Protocol meaningful.
Okay, perhaps we'll catch up with you at the end of the week and see where we are.
Okay, sure. My pleasure.
Thanks for speaking to us.
Okay.